In a small shop at the end of a narrow street, a man spent 40 years doing something that almost no one else in the country still did. He bought and sold old family Bibles, not the new ones, not the printings you can find in any store today, but the heavy leather volumes that families kept on a stand near the front door for 200 years. And near the end of his life, after handling thousands of these books, he said something strange to a younger collector who had come to learn the trade. He said that if you laid a Bible printed before 1850 next to one printed after, and you knew exactly where to look, you would find that things had quietly gone missing. Not torn out, not damaged, simply gone, edition to edition, as if someone had decided certain pages no longer needed to exist. He was the last dealer in his region who specialized in these pre-1850 volumes, and when he closed his shop, a particular kind of knowledge closed with him. Tonight we are going to follow what he claimed page by page and look at what the historical record actually shows about how these books changed, why they changed, and who benefited from the changes that almost no family ever noticed. Before we go further, if you find these forgotten corners of history worth your time, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who would never otherwise hear them, and it costs you nothing but a second. Now let us get back to the shop and to the books. The first thing to understand is what a family Bible actually was before 1850. Because it was not only a religious book, it was the single most important financial and legal document most ordinary households would ever own. In an age before reliable government registration of births, marriages, and deaths, the blank pages bound into the center of a large family Bible served as the official record of a family's existence. A birth written in ink on that page, witnessed and dated, could later be used to prove a person's age, their legitimacy, their right to inherit land, and their claim to a name. Courts accepted these entries as evidence. Estates were divided based on them. When the antique dealer talked about what went missing between editions, he was not only talking about scripture. He was talking about the architecture of the book itself, the parts that surrounded the family record and gave it weight, and those parts were tied directly to money, property, and inheritance in ways that have been largely forgotten. Consider the structure of a typical large family Bible printed around the year 1800. It did not simply contain the scripture. It opened with elaborate front matter. There were dedications, often to a monarch or a church authority. There were lengthy prefaces explaining the history of the translation. There were tables, and this is where the dealer's attention always went first. Early family Bibles frequently included extensive chronological tables that placed every major biblical event against a specific calendar year, counting backward from the present day all the way to a fixed date of creation. These chronologies were not vague. They were printed with confidence, listing the supposed year of the flood, the year of the founding of cities, the precise ages of patriarchs, and the exact span of time the editors believed had passed since the beginning of the world. To a family in 1800, this table was not decoration. It told them in numbers exactly how old the world was and exactly where they stood in its story. The dealer's claim was that these chronological tables shrank, softened, and in many later printings disappeared entirely. And here the historical record agrees with him, though the reasons are more interesting than any conspiracy. Through the first half of the 19th century, the geological sciences were quietly producing a problem that no Bible publisher could ignore. The study of rock layers and fossils was generating evidence that the Earth was vastly older than the printed chronologies allowed. A chronology that confidently stated a creation date became, within a few decades, a commercial liability. It invited ridicule. It dated the book. A publisher who wanted to sell Bibles to a modernizing, increasingly educated public had a simple choice. Keep printing a number that a growing portion of customers now found embarrassing, or quietly drop the table and let the scripture stand on its own. Most chose the second path, and they did it without announcement. The chronology did not get debated on the title page. It simply was not reset in the next edition. A family comparing their grandfather's Bible to their own would find that the old certainty about the age of the world had evaporated, and no note explained where it had gone. But the chronological tables were only the beginning of what the dealer pointed to. He was even more interested in a section that appeared in a surprising number of early family Bibles, and that almost never appears in later ones. Many large Bibles printed before 1850, especially the expensive subscription editions sold to prosperous households, contained extensive supplementary material aimed directly at the management of a family's worldly affairs. There were tables for calculating interest. There were guides to weights and measures across different regions and countries. There were calendars projecting feast days and market days, decades into the future. Some included detailed instructions on the making of wills, the proper witnessing of documents, and the legal language a family should use when recording a transfer of property. The family Bible, in other words, was sold and used as a household reference manual for economic life, and the religious text sat at the center of a thick practical apparatus. This is where the revisionist thread of tonight's story begins to tighten, because the disappearance of that practical apparatus was not random. It tracked almost step for step the rise of new institutions that wanted those functions for themselves. Think about what an interest table in a family Bible actually represented. It meant that an ordinary household could calculate at its own kitchen table whether a loan was fair. It meant a family did not need to take a lender's word for what they owed. As banking expanded through the 19th century, and as lending became a professional industry rather than a neighbourly arrangement, the independent ability of households to check the math became commercially inconvenient for the people doing the lending. The dealer never claimed that bankers marched into print shops and demanded the tables be removed. His claim was quieter and more unsettling. He said that the tables simply stopped being included decade by decade in exactly the period when an entire industry would have preferred ordinary people to rely on professional calculation rather than their own. The same pattern, he argued, appeared with the legal material. Early family Bibles that taught families how to write a valid will in plain language were quietly slimmed down in an era when the legal profession was organizing itself, standardizing its training, and establishing itself as the necessary intermediary for exactly those documents. A family that could draft a competent will from the guidance bound into their own Bible was a family that did not need to pay for the service. Again, the dealer was careful. He did not say lawyers conspired against Bible publishers. He said that the practical legal sections vanished from the books across precisely the decades when the profession had every reason to prefer that they vanish, and that the publishers, who were businessmen, had no particular reason to keep printing material that no longer helped them sell books to a public being taught to defer to experts. To understand why a publisher would make these cuts so readily, you have to understand how these Bibles were actually sold, and this is a piece of economic history that has been almost entirely forgotten. The large family Bible of the early 19th century was, in most cases, not bought off a shelf. It was sold by subscription, through agents who went door to door across the countryside. An agent would carry a sample, a single ornate volume, and would take orders from families who paid in installments over months or even years before the finished book was delivered. This subscription model shaped everything about the book. Because families were paying a significant sum, the publishers loaded the early sample editions with features. More engravings, more maps, more tables, more supplementary sections. The thickness of the book was the selling point. The agent could open the sample and show a family everything they would receive for their money, and the practical sections, the interest tables and the legal guides and the family record pages were part of the pitch. They made the book feel like an heirloom and a tool at the same time. But the subscription model also created the exact pressure that would later strip those features away. Publishing a heavily illustrated, table-laden Bible was expensive, and competition among Bible publishers was fierce. Every engraving cost money to commission and print. Every supplementary table took space and paper. As the century went on, and as cheaper printing technology made plainer Bibles affordable to almost everyone, the elaborate subscription Bible came under price pressure from below. The publishers responded the way businesses always respond to price pressure. They looked for things to cut. And the easiest things to cut were precisely the supplementary sections, because no customer would refuse to buy a Bible simply because it lacked an interest table. The scripture had to stay, the family record pages had to stay, because that was emotionally central to the sale. But the chronology, the weights and measures, the legal guidance, the financial tables, all of that was, from a pure business standpoint, optional. So it went. The dealer's lifetime of handling these books had simply made visible to him a process that was, underneath, an ordinary story of cost-cutting in a competitive industry. And yet the dealer insisted there was something more than cost-cutting at work. And the most provocative part of his claim concerned not the supplementary material but the scripture and its framing. He never claimed that the words of scripture themselves were rewritten between these editions, and it is important to be precise here, because that would be a much larger and far less defensible claim. What he claimed was subtler. He said that the apparatus around the scripture, the chapter summaries, the marginal notes, the cross-references, the explanatory headings, changed in ways that quietly shifted how a reader understood certain passages, particularly passages dealing with debt, lending, wealth, and the obligations between rich and poor. This is worth slowing down on because it is the heart of the revisionist argument. The scripture of the older tradition contains a great deal of material about economic life. There are passages about the forgiveness of debts, about the periodic release of those bound by obligation, about restrictions on charging interest, about the moral hazards of accumulated wealth, and about a recurring cycle in which debts were meant to be cancelled and land returned to its original families. In the older Bibles, the dealer claimed, the marginal notes and chapter headings tended to present these passages plainly, as direct instructions with explanatory notes that connected them to one another and treated them as a coherent economic teaching. In many later editions, he said, the same passages survived word for word, but the surrounding apparatus increasingly framed them as historical description of ancient practice rather than living instruction. A chapter heading might shift from a phrasing that read as a command to a phrasing that read as a record of what an ancient people once did. A marginal note that once explained how a debt release applied might be shortened, generalized, or simply dropped. The effect, if the dealer was right, was profound and almost invisible. The text did not change. The reader's relationship to the text changed. A family in 1800 opening their Bible to a passage on the cancellation of debts would find an apparatus that treated it as relevant guidance. A family in 1880 opening to the identical words would find an apparatus that gently positioned the passage as an artifact of a vanished world. No one had to censor anything. The words were all still there. But the editorial frame had moved, and the frame is what most readers actually rely on to know how seriously to take what they are reading. Now, the honest position here is that this part of the dealer's claim is the hardest to verify, and a careful historian has to say so plainly. Marginal notes and chapter headings in Bibles did genuinely change enormously across editions and across the different publishing houses, and they always had. Different translations carried different study apparatus. Different denominations commissioned different notes. A great deal of the variation the dealer noticed was simply the ordinary diversity of a crowded publishing market rather than a coordinated shift. It would be a mistake to leave tonight's story believing that a single hidden hand rewrote the framing of the world's most printed book. The publishing of Bibles in the 19th century was chaotic, competitive, and decentralized, and that messiness is itself the best argument against any simple conspiracy. But the dealer's deeper point survives even that caution, and this is what makes his 40 years in the shop genuinely valuable. His point was that the family Bible was an economic document, and that economic documents are always shaped, consciously or not, by the economic interests of the age that produces them. The early family Bible, sold by subscription to property-owning households, was shaped to serve a world in which a family managed its own affairs, kept its own records, calculated its own interest, drafted its own wills, and read its scripture as direct practical guidance about money and obligation. The later family Bible, mass-produced for a public increasingly served by banks, lawyers, and government registries, was shaped gradually and without any single decision to serve a world in which those functions had moved outside the home. The book got thinner, not because anyone hated the missing pages, but because the world those pages served was being dismantled and rebuilt around the family rather than within it. There is a particular detail the dealer used to demonstrate this, and it is the most concrete and verifiable part of his entire account. It concerns the family record pages themselves, the blank leaves for births, marriages, and deaths. In the earliest family Bibles he handled, these pages were often elaborate, with printed columns, ruled lines, and sometimes printed instructions on how entries should be witnessed to hold up as evidence. The book itself was teaching the family how to make a legally durable record. As the 19th century progressed and governments across the developed world established compulsory civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths, the legal weight of the Bible entry steadily declined. And the family record pages in the Bibles changed to match. They became simpler. The instructions on witnessing disappeared. The pages became sentimental rather than legal, a place for memory rather than a place for evidence. This shift is well documented, and it is the clearest possible illustration of the dealer's whole thesis. The Bible page lost its legal power not because of anything inside the Bible, but because the state had built an institution to take that power over, and the book quietly adjusted to its reduced role. So when families today open an inherited Bible and find those simple, sentimental record pages, they are usually unaware that they are looking at the faded descendant of what was once a working legal instrument. The grandeur of the old subscription Bibles the dealer believed was the grandeur of a document that genuinely governed a family's economic and legal life. The plainness of the later ones was the plainness of a book that had been gently relieved of its duties by a modernizing world. The dealer kept a second example close at hand whenever he explained this, and it concerned the calendars and almanac material bound into the older books. A large family Bible printed in the early decades of the 19th century frequently carried more than a simple list of holy days. It carried tables that projected the movable feasts years and sometimes decades into the future, tables of the phases of the moon, notes on the changing length of daylight through the seasons, and in many editions practical agricultural guidance tied to that calendar. For a farming household, this was working knowledge. Knowing when the moon would be full mattered for planning night travel and night labour. Knowing the projected dates of seasonal change mattered for planting and harvest. The family Bible, in this respect, functioned as the household almanac, and it bound the rhythm of religious observance to the rhythm of economic work in a single volume that sat in the centre of the home. As the century advanced, cheap printed almanacs became widely available as separate publications, sold for a few coins and replaced every year. The astronomical and agricultural tables migrated out of the Bible and into these disposable annual pamphlets, and then later into newspapers, and the family Bible quietly surrendered its role as the keeper of the working calendar. Once again, no one removed anything in anger. A function simply found a cheaper home, and the book grew lighter by exactly the weight of that function. There is a further dimension here that the dealer found especially revealing, and it concerns the engraved maps. The expensive subscription Bibles were often sold partly on the strength of their maps, detailed engravings of ancient lands, of the routes of journeys described in Scripture, of cities and territories, and the divisions of land among families and tribes. To a household that owned almost no other printed maps of anything, these engravings were among the only cartographic images they would ever study closely. They taught a particular and very physical idea, that land was something measured, divided, recorded, and inherited, and that the division of land among families was a serious and sacred matter. The dealer argued that as printed maps of the real world became common, and as atlases and schoolbooks took over the teaching of geography, the maps in the family Bible lost their unique value and were among the first elements cut to reduce printing costs. A household that once learned the very concept of mapped and divided land from the engravings in its Bible would, a few generations later, own a Bible with no maps at all, and would learn geography entirely from sources owned and produced outside the home. Let us step back and place this whole story in its proper economic frame, because this is finally a piece of revisionist economic history rather than a tale of hidden tampering. The conventional way to tell the story of the 19th century is as a story of progress. Civil registration meant accurate records. Professional banking meant a sophisticated economy. An organized legal profession meant competent and consistent law. A public school system meant literacy. All of that is true, and none of it should be dismissed. But the dealer's books let us see the cost side of that ledger, the part that the progress story tends to leave out. Every one of those new institutions absorbed a function that families had previously performed for themselves, often using the tools bound into a single book they already owned. The expansion of professional and state institutions was, among other things, a transfer of competence. Capabilities that had lived in the household, supported by the practical apparatus of the family Bible, moved outward into specialized hands. And because the transfer happened slowly, edition by edition, decade by decade, almost no one experienced it as a loss. Each generation simply received a slightly thinner book and assumed it had always been that way. This is why the dealer mattered, and why his retirement was a genuine loss of knowledge. He was one of the very few people alive who had personally handled enough of the old books across enough decades of printing to see the thinning as a single continuous process, rather than as a series of unrelated editions. A historian reads about civil registration in one source, about banking in another, about the legal profession in a third, and about printing economics in a fourth. The dealer held all of it in his hands at once, in the physical form of the books themselves, and the books told the story as one story. The slow migration of economic and legal competence out of the ordinary household was written quite literally in the changing thickness and contents of the family Bible. There is one more layer to consider, and it concerns who lost the most when these books were thinned. The elaborate subscription Bibles were expensive, and they were bought disproportionately by middling families, by farmers and tradespeople and small property holders. These were exactly the households for whom the practical apparatus mattered most. A wealthy family had access to lawyers and bankers regardless. A poor family had little property to manage. But the middling household, the family with some land, some savings, a will to write and an estate to divide, relied on its own competence, and the family Bible was a central tool of that competence. When the practical sections disappeared, it was this broad middle layer of society that quietly lost a measure of its independence, becoming, over a few generations, customers of the very professions that now handled what the book had once handled for free. The dealer would also point out something easy to miss about the way these books were paid for, because the subscription system itself was a piece of economic history that the thinning of the books erased. When a family bought a large Bible on installment from a traveling agent, they were entering into a credit arrangement, and the agent's ledger, the record of who had paid what and who still owed, was itself a kind of informal financial network spread across the countryside. The interest tables and the practical financial guidance bound into the very book being sold this way were therefore not abstract. They were tools a family could use to understand the terms of the purchase in front of them and every other transaction in their life. There is a quiet irony the dealer enjoyed in this. The most heavily equipped Bibles, the ones richest in the tools of household financial independence, were sold through one of the first widespread consumer credit systems many rural families ever encountered. The book taught self-reliance, while the method of selling it was teaching families to live with installment debt. As the elaborate editions gave way to cheap shelf-bought Bibles, both halves of that arrangement faded together, and the family was left with neither the door-to-door agent nor the thick apparatus of financial guidance, but with a thin book and a growing array of distant institutions ready to manage money on its behalf. The dealer used to say that you could hold the entire economic transformation of the modern world in 2 volumes, put a heavy subscription Bible from around 1820 in one hand and a plain mass-market Bible from around 1890 in the other. The same scripture sits at the centre of both, but around that centre, in the first book, is a thick layer of tools for a family to govern its own affairs, and in the second book that layer is mostly gone, replaced by empty space and sentiment. The difference in weight between those 2 books is the weight of everything that moved from the household to the institution in the span of a single human lifetime. He did not tell this story bitterly. He was not arguing that the modern world is worse, and neither am I. Civil registration genuinely protects people. Professional banking genuinely enables an economy that lifts millions out of poverty. The point of revisionist history is not to declare the past superior. It is to recover the parts of the story that the comfortable version leaves out, so that we understand what was actually traded away, and can decide for ourselves whether the trade was fair. The dealer's life work was to keep visible a transfer of power that the progress story renders invisible. And he did it with nothing more than a shop full of old books, and the patience to notice what changed between them. When he finally closed his shop, the young collector who had listened to all of this asked him what he hoped people would remember. The old man said something simple. He said that the next time someone inherits an old family Bible, before they shelve it as a quaint religious relic, they should open it fully and look at everything that is not scripture. Look at the tables. Look at the record pages. Look at whatever practical guidance is bound inside. Because those pages are a portrait of how a family was once expected to stand on its own, and the difference between an old Bible and a new one is a measurement in paper and ink of how much of that self-reliance the modern world has quietly taken into its own hands. The book remembers, he said, even when the family has forgotten. And so the last antique dealer of pre-1850 family Bibles left behind no grand theory and no secret. He left behind only a way of looking, a method. The understanding that the most ordinary object in a household can be a historical document of the first importance if you are willing to compare it patiently against its older self and ask not only what it says, but what it has stopped saying and why, and to whose advantage. He believed this method could be carried far beyond Bibles. Apply the same patient comparison to old school books, to old farming manuals, to any object that families once kept and replaced, edition by edition, and you will find the same quiet story written into the changing pages. You will find competence migrating outward, knowledge that households once held being slowly relocated into industries and institutions. The family Bible was simply the clearest example, because more families kept one, kept it longer, and kept it across more editions than almost any other book in the world. That is the inheritance the dealer passed to the one young person who stayed to listen. And tonight, in passing it to you, the shop is open once more. Open the book fully, turn past the scripture and read everything else.